Hi everyone. How do you identify verbs in English sentences? Well, there are several ways to do this, but for now I want to show you a very simplistic way. I have developed this simple flow chart to help students to understand the big picture of English verbs. As you can see in this flow chart, I have divided verbs into two kinds, two functions, and two voices. Of course, this is a very simplistic overview of verbs. Nevertheless, students have found this very helpful in their endeavour to learn to identify English verbs in sentences. So today I want to look at two kinds of verbs with examples. Also, I want to look at two functions of verbs with examples. And finally, I want to look at two voices of verbs with examples. At the end, I will summarise this material with a quick test. But let's begin with the two kinds of verbs. First, we have action verbs. Action verbs are verbs that show action or ownership. Action verbs can come with a direct object or without a direct object. If you're struggling to understand direct objects or indirect objects, you can watch this video for more information. Let's look at some examples to identify action verbs. David played the guitar at church. The verb played shows action. David played the guitar. The guitar is the direct object and the receiver of the action. Let's look at another example. Jonathan speaks professionally every time. The verb speaks shows action. Jonathan speaks. Notice there is no direct object, but it is still an action verb. Let's look at another example. Peter has a coffee for lunch. Has is an action verb that shows ownership. We can ask the question, Peter has what? Well, Peter has a coffee, which is the direct object. Keep in mind, action verbs show action or ownership. Second, we have linking verbs, often referred to as state of being verbs. Linking verbs are verbs that link the subject to a word in the sentence that renames the subject or describes the subject of the sentence. These words are often referred to as predicate nominatives or predicate adjectives. For example, Elizabeth is the manager of the store. Manager renames the subject Elizabeth and therefore is a predicate nominative. So is in this sentence is a linking verb. Let's look at another example. Elizabeth looks beautiful today. Beautiful describes the subject Elizabeth and therefore is a predicate adjective. The verb looks here in this sentence is a linking verb. Again, keep in mind, linking verbs link the subject to another word in the sentence and it renames or describes the subject. So there are two kinds of verbs, action verbs or linking verbs. Let's move on. How do verbs function in sentences? Well, they are either transitive or intransitive. Let's begin with transitive verbs. Transitive verbs carry action from the doer, which is the subject of the sentence, to the receiver, which is the direct object in the sentence. For example, James kicked the ball in the backyard. Notice the ball received the action of the verb kick and therefore is transitive. Let's look at another example. Paul broke the mirror accidentally. Notice The mirror received the action of the verb broke and therefore is transitive. Let's move on to intransitive verbs. Intransitive verbs do not carry the action from the doer to the receiver. Instead, intransitive verbs complete the action themselves. For example, John spoke truthfully at the meeting. Notice there is no receiver of the action. Therefore, it is intransitive. Let's look at another example. Rebecca sang passionately at church. Notice again there is no receiver of the action. Therefore, it is intransitive. Also, keep in mind all linking verbs are intransitive. That's important to remember. So verbs are either transitive, that is, a transitive verb carries the action from doer to receiver, or intransitive. An intransitive verb does not carry the action from doer to receiver. Finally, we have voice. Now there are two voices of verbs. There is active voice and passive voice. Let's look at the verb chart again. I want you to notice only transitive verbs have voice. Now, voice tells us whether the subject of the sentence is acting or being acted upon. Let's look at active voice. Active voice tells us that the subject performs the action and the direct object receives the action. For example, David played the guitar at church. Notice David performs the action and the direct object, the guitar, receives the action. Therefore, played here is in the active voice. Let's look at another example. Rebecca walks her dog in the afternoon. Notice Rebecca performs the action and the direct object, dogs, receive the action. Therefore, walks here is in the active voice. Let's look at passive voice. Passive voice tells us that the subject receives the action. For example, the bike was ridden by Timothy. Notice the subject, the bike, receives the action. Therefore, the verb is passive. Let's look at another example. The car was driven by Peter. Notice the car received the action. Therefore, the verb is passive. Let's put active voice and passive voice side by side to see the difference. Timothy rode the bike. The verb rode is in the active voice because the subject Timothy performs the action. The bike was ridden by Timothy. The verb was ridden is in the passive voice because the subject bike receives the action. Let's sum it up. There are two kinds of verbs. There are action verbs and there are linking verbs. Action verbs show action and ownership. Linking verbs link the subject to another word in the sentence and it renames the subject or describes the subject. There are two functions of verbs. There are transitive verbs and there are intransitive verbs. Transitive verbs carry the action from the doer to the receiver, whereas intransitive verbs do not carry action to the receiver. Instead, they complete the action themselves. There are two voices, active and passive. Active voice tells us if the subject performs the action, whereas passive voice tells us if the subject receives the action. Let's see if we can identify the verbs in these sentences. Let's test our ability to identify English verbs in sentences. For example, Peter drove his car to work every day. The verb drove is an action verb because it shows action. The verb drove is transitive because drove carried the action from the doer, Peter, to the receiver, car. The verb drove is also active voice because the subject Peter performed the action. Let's look at one more example. Jenny is the manager of the football team. The verb is a linking verb. The manager renames the subject Jenny. Therefore, is in this sentence is a linking verb. We know that all linking verbs are intransitive, and intransitive verbs do not have voice. Hopefully this verb chart will help you identify verbs in English sentences. I would encourage you also to watch this video because it will help you understand direct objects or indirect objects so that you can identify English verbs.